Casual and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh players can't agree on that many topics. However, one thing that both parties actually love to complain about is card prices, and I completely get it. You know, whether or not it's an expensive card that you really need for your tournament deck, I mean, it might be an archetype card, it might be a generic card, or if it's a collector's item, people just love complaining about card prices, and I totally understand where you're coming from. However, there is a very, very big difference between expensive cards and overpriced cards, and in today's video we're going to talk about expensive cards that were worth the price. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there are cards out there that even though they are very expensive and even though they are seeing competitive play, they might be a little bit overpriced, and also they might barely just be better than a budget alternative. What I'm talking about is the case of something like Infinite Impermanence and Effect Veiler. Now, the most competitive players are most likely going to buy Infinite Impermanence. Obviously, the card is a little less good now that Thanos Dragon is out and people like to maybe just play Effect Veiler, but in the past couple months here, the past like 9 months here, a lot of people have chosen to play Infinite Impermanence over Effect Veiler. Now, on paper, both cards look very similar, but there are some really important situations where Infinite Impermanence is a lot better. It can't be hit by Called by the Grave, which is a big one, but more importantly, I think when you go second and you draw Infinite Impermanence as your 6th card, you can use it to negate a card on the field. Something like Thanos Dragon Colossus, or maybe even bait the negation of something like Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss. These are all things that you can't do with Effect Veiler because Effect Veiler only works on your opponent's turn. Now, to some budget players, which is perfectly fine, they're not going to pick up copies of Infinite Impermanence if they already have Effect Veiler. Obviously, the most competitive players are going to play whatever card will give them the highest percentage chance of winning, but in today's video, I'm going to talk about 5 expensive cards that were worth it, and what I mean by that is cards that when you played them, you could tell that they were expensive, and you can tell there was nothing else out there that did what they were doing. At number 5, we have Maxi. Now, it is worth mentioning when this card was first released in Storm of Ragnarok, it actually wasn't that expensive. However, when Billy Break later on in 2011 managed to win back-to-back YCSs with main decked copies of Maxi, suddenly people started paying attention, and this card quickly, overnight almost, increased to $100 per copy. Now, not every single card on this list is going to be over $100 per copy, but in the case of Maxi, it sat at that price for months, and even once it eventually got reprinted, the reprints tended to be pretty expensive. Actually, right now, the ultimate rare copy is pretty close to that original $100 price tag, despite the fact that this card has been banned for over a year. But Maxi is one of those original hand traps out there, right alongside Effect Veiler and DD Crow, that a lot of people remember when they think of old school or sort of middle school Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it's not quite an old school card, but it is sort of right in the middle of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Where Yu-Gi-Oh! Was sort of transitioning into more what we know it as today, and Maxi was one of the best cards in 2011. It's extremely good to use Maxi on an effect that special summons. Obviously, you can shotgun this effect to sort of prevent your opponent from trying anything crazy, but the best cases for Maxi are when your opponent is trying to start off their string of combos and you can use it to draw 1, 2, or even more cards. Now, why I say this card was worth it was because there's basically no other card in the game that does what Maxi does, especially when the card first started coming into popular play for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Drawing a bunch of cards is obviously very good, but what Maxi in many situations just said on it, instead of drawing a bunch of cards, it basically just told your opponent to skip their turn, especially the decks that were very special summon heavy. Now, in the OCG, this card is currently at 3 copies per deck, and it definitely changes their format a lot in comparison to our format. I don't know if this card will ever come back into the TCG. I know a lot of players want it to, and I think if it does come back, if we can just look at the ultimate rare version of this card's price to sort of get an idea, I think this card will shoot up tremendously in value. Right now, these secret rares are only $20, and I don't know when this card or if this card will ever come back, but I can see very clearly if this card does come back, even though it's been reprinted time and time again as common and super and a secret and ultimate rare, even with all those reprints and original prints, this card very likely will just skyrocket in price if it ever comes off the ban list, even at 1 copy. This is a card that there's basically no replacement for. Thanos Dragon kind of does what it does, but this is truly one of the best hand traps out there, and currently the only hand trap that is banned on the Forbidden and Limited list. When Solemn Strike was first released in the first quarter of 2016 in Breakers of Shadow, it was worth around $50 to $65 depending on which week you're looking at. And it was worth it. Let me tell you that when Solemn Strike came out, there's basically no card in the game that did what it did. Now we have a couple other options. We have Solemn Judgment back, and of course you have your one copy of Solemn Warning, and I guess some people experimented with Solemn Scolding, but for the most part, Solemn Strike was sort of in a class of its own. It was a triplicate counterspell in a world where people were only usually able to play one counterspell, that one Solemn Warning, and it changed the game for good. It was not only a card that countered Pendulum Summoning very easily, but also a card that was used in many of the Pendulum decks because you could search it out with Guiding Ariadne. After that, it continued to be a very popular card. It obviously has, just like in the case of Maxi, an ultimate rare printing, and it still sees play today. You see it seen play in Sky Striker, you see it seen play in Altergeist, sometimes in Salamangreat. It's one of the last remaining really powerful trap cards that a lot of people agree is good for a lot of reasons. Stopping hand traps is super useful, stopping special summons is super useful, stopping all sorts of different effects at all sorts of different speeds. Because Solemn Strike is a counter trap, you can negate stuff at any stage of the game, even in the damage step, and that's a pretty big deal for players that maybe aren't playing that many trap cards. If they're going to play a trap card, a real trap card, not like Infinite Impermanence, they're going to play something like Solemn Strike because its effect is so impactful even 3 years after it was released. At number 3, we have one of my all-time favorite cards in this game, even though I haven't played it very recently, and that's Pot of Desires. Now, a lot of people know this, but when Pot of Desires came out, it was a lot more of a controversial card than it is these days. Now, I know people still complain about Pot of Desires if it's a neg-9 or if it's a +1, and while that debate is kind of a meme at this point, when it first came out, people really were debating how good or bad the card was. However, competitive players realized the card was ridiculous because please keep in mind, when Pot of Desires first came out, there were months where there wasn't Ash Blossom in the metagame. That card simply didn't exist yet, which meant that when you used Pot of Desires, it resolved 99% of the time. It's actually funny, I made a video a long time ago titled Pot of Desires is Garbage, and in that video I sort of mentioned, because the commenter was talking about, oh, it just gets negated a lot, I mentioned that, okay, it actually doesn't get negated very often. There aren't a lot of cards that can negate Desires. Little did I know that in a few months we would get Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, which would negate the card. However, when the card first came out, it was a staple 3 of in virtually every single competitive deck, and the price reflected that because it was around $70 to $90 at its peak price. I think there was like one day where it hit 100, but for the most part you're looking at $70 to $90 per copy. That's obviously a lot of money to drop on one card. However, unlike a lot of the other cards that have seen like $100 status, I will say I got my mileage out of Pot of Desires. I bought it on day 1. I took it to tournament after tournament after tournament. I still own those copies today. A lot of times when you're looking at these expensive cards, even though it really sucks, the best time to purchase them is right when they come out, because then you get the most value out of them. Sure, you had to pay a little bit more money up front, or in some cases a lot more money up front, but you got to use them at a time when many other players weren't able to use them, and over the course of a year or 2 years where you're using the card, the value ends up just being like $10 or $20 per month when you're looking at those types of expensive cards. However, it is worth mentioning in the case of Pot of Desires, the card did get reprinted about a year later. It was a Megaton promo, and yet I don't regret buying my copies for, I think I bought them for $75 a piece, because I got so much use out of it and I played it at so many different tournaments, and really that card was so broken before Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring came out. Obviously now it's a little bit more of a debate because it can just get negated so easily, but back when it first came out and there's no counters to it, or very few counters to it, yeah, it was worth its price tag. It said draw 2, the cost really didn't matter in those decks back in the day, and overall it was one of the best purchases that I ever made in Yu-Gi-Oh! As far as expensive cards go. Speaking of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, that's actually the number 2 spot on this list, and some people might not know this, I've mentioned this a few times, but Ash Blossom when it first came out was actually cheaper than just a couple months later. I know this because I bought the card on release and it was for $45 per copy. Now obviously that is pretty expensive relative to many of the other cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! But the card eventually shot up to like $80 to $90, and even after it got reprinted in the Kaiba Legendary Collection, it was still around $50 to $60, and even after it got reprinted reprinted again as a super rare, you were looking at $30 to $40. It wasn't right up until the recent common reprint of Ash Blossom that it finally settled around $10, and that's still a lot just for a common card in a structure deck. However, Ash Blossom is worth it, and it will continue to be worth it because it's a card that you can play 3 copies of, and it's a card that you can play in any deck against any deck. Now, some people don't like cards that are that generic, but Ash Blossom hasn't always been good. It's not necessarily good every single format. Obviously, when it first came out, the reason it was only quote-unquote $40 is because it wasn't very good against cards like Zodiac Barrage or Dragonic Diagram, but nowadays, and pretty much after that exact format, the Zodiac format, it's been really solid in almost every single situation. So it's a card that even if you paid a lot of money for it, you got your mileage out of it as long as you were going to tournaments. It's also a hand trap that can interact with cards that a lot of other hand traps can't. Many hand traps focus on monster cards, but where Ash Blossom is sort of different is that it can interact with spell cards, against Pot of Desires, against Skystriker Engage, against every single search spell in the game, and that was sort of unique for hand traps at that time. You have Droll Lockbird, of course, but that only works against a few specific things, and it doesn't hit the thing originally that your opponent uses, but Ash Blossom can be used against a variety of your opponent's starter cards, which made it really solid in many formats. And that brings us to a more modern card, a card that is currently over $100, and that's Thanos Dragon. Yes, Thanos himself, a card that many players are currently playing in a variety of decks. You see it in Salamangreats, you see it in every single Thunder Dragon list, you see it in basically every single deck out there except Skystriker, and for a good reason. It's the closest thing to Maxi that we have in 2019 TCG format. It's a card that not only puts a body on your field, not only gets you a +1, not only recycles cards into your deck if you don't want to have them in your hand, but also has an on-field disruption effect to stop your opponent's targeting effects affecting your monsters. Overall, this is just a card that right now definitely feels like over $100. There isn't another card that you can play in replace of Thanos that actually feels like that same power level, and that sort of reflects itself in the price tag of the card. I would imagine this card would get reprinted in next year's Megaton, so it won't stay this expensive for that long. However, I think very similar to things like Skull Dread and Evenly Matched and Borlo Dragon, even after this card receives a Megaton reprint, assuming it's not one of the promo cards, it'll probably still be around $30 to $40 just because it's basically playable in every single deck out there except Striker. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on 5 expensive cards that were worth the price. Obviously there's tons of expensive cards that don't stay at that price forever. Actually, most cards do not continue to be over $50, over $100. However, for the people that are willing to dish out the cash, you want to be putting it in cards that actually are very usable, that there aren't a lot of replacements for. For example, if you could only afford Infinite Impermanence or Thanos, you probably should buy Thanos because you can just play Effect Filler instead of Infinite Impermanence. Obviously, it's getting reprinted. I'm sort of referring to just right now if you needed it for the next couple weeks. But overall, when you're looking at cards that you're actually dishing out hundreds of dollars for a playset, you want to pick cards that there isn't a replacement for. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.